You come from the Asia Pacific region in a very fascinating way. You arrived in Australia, as I understand it, at about 25 years of age, from Belgium, a lawyer, from Belgium of German descent, and quickly worked your way into the political process, drawing upon your skills that you'd exercised elsewhere in Europe to assist leadership within Australia in the political process, trade policy, etc., and rose to become I think the longest serving Minister of Finance of Australia, a leader of the government in the Senate. And by all that I see, drawing upon my own 22 years background in political life, a very powerful and influential political leader in Australia. So now you're the Secretary General of the OECD. I think you bring a unique perspective. If I may, how does that background of yours, that perspective of yours, give you a different lens as you take on this task, which you've just started a few months ago?
Well, look, thank you for that very generous introduction. Look, you're right. I do come to this role both with a European background, having, I was born in Europe, I grew up in Europe, I was educated in Europe, but then migrated to Australia as a young man, where I pursued essentially, my entire professional career up until the time of taking on this job. So I did bring really both a European background and perspective, as well as, of course, my experiences and networks, having been a senior member of the government in Australia and operating across, I guess, the broader Asia Pacific. Look, the OECD is an incredibly important organization. It's 60 years old, and over that time, it's become a platform for international cooperation across like-minded countries who share a commitment to democracy, to human rights, to the rule of law, to market-based economic principles, a rules-based international order, and that is more important than ever. There are a whole series of very significant challenges to be addressed, where we need to find the best possible solutions. And the OECD is a great platform to facilitate cooperation for comparative policy analysis and advice, to identify policy best practice, and to set standards consistent with our values. So, I feel that in many ways I bring the best of both worlds in a way. Both the European background as well as the non-European background, but also, I would suggest relevant economic policy, fiscal policy, political leadership experience, and hopefully I can deploy that to the benefit of OECD member countries and beyond.
Indeed. Look, you unquestionably bring a different lens, a different perspective. If you were to give this audience, the OECD sponsors 1,500 events a year. It is a massive organization in a time when every fact is challenged and every conspiracy theory is amplified. The fact that you're a fact-based organization is so critical, more critical than ever. But if you were to take 2 or 3 areas that really are most important to you during your tenure as Secretary General, what would those areas be? I've got 5 priority areas, and they're not just my priority areas. I would say that they're priority areas for the OECD membership and indeed for countries around the world. Right now, we are very focused on optimizing the strength and the quality of the post-COVID recovery. I think that is a self-evident priority, and as a platform to help share experiences and help countries learn from each other's successes and each other's failures, and to sort of swap notes on what works, what doesn't work. I think that that is an important area of focus for us. But then, of course,
like the virus, which doesn't stop at any country's border, emissions don't stop at anybody's border. And there is a clear and obvious need for appropriately ambitious but globally coordinated action on climate change. And I think that the OECD there has an important role to play in helping to support global leadership to help get the world to global net zero by 2050. And then, before the pandemic, but further accelerated during the pandemic, we were underway. I mean, the digital transformation of our economies was already underway. It's been accelerated in the course of the pandemic. The digital transformation brings many benefits. It brings many opportunities. It also comes with a whole series of new-ish, but certainly growing, evolving risks, challenges, and disruptions. And I mean, I guess as a policy think tank, as a platform for cooperation, there's a lot of policy work to be done there, from making sure that governments are making the best possible decisions in terms of ensuring access to the necessary digital infrastructure, universal, affordable, competitively priced access, making sure that from an education and skills development point of view, that people have the opportunity to genuinely participate and benefit from that digital transformation, to cybersecurity, to privacy, to competition policy implications, to the disruption of government's capacity to raise tax revenue from corporations working in their respective markets. And on that latter point, of course, we're very involved in helping to reform international taxation arrangements to ensure that in a globalized, digitalized world, those taxation arrangements are more effective, more certain, but also more fair and equitable. And then finally, the OECD stands for the sustainable expansion of global trade. Global markets, well-functioning global markets, a global rules-based trading system in good working order are very important. And to the extent that we can provide a united voice supporting reform efforts to ensure that our global rules-based trading system is indeed in the best possible working order, I think that's another important area of focus. As you've already observed, I do come, out of the Asia Pacific, the Asia Pacific, Asia is the part of the world where most of the global growth will be generated for some time to come, and I do think it's important for the OECD, for OECD member countries, to be more engaged, more focused on Asia, and then as an organization, we need to further strengthen our policy focus and our engagement with Asia, in particular countries across Southeast Asia, and that's certainly something that I'm personally very focused on.
Well, let's take some of the 5 items that you've talked about and dig a little deeper on some of those. On the issue of the digitalized economy and appropriate level of taxation of the large conglomerates that function in that economy, you've made it a priority to seek agreement with like-minded countries around the world. You just talked about it again in your comments. How confident are you that an agreement, in fact, will be reached, and what kind of time frame should we be thinking about in that regard?
Well, this process has been underway for a little while, and a few months ago, in the context of the work that the OECD has been doing, we reached agreement now with 134 out of 140 members that are involved in the so-called OECD G20 inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting. Now, there's been an in-principle agreement around the 2-pillar statement for reform, it essentially focuses on a better sharing the taxing rights, ensuring that large multinational digital companies in particular, and all large businesses, in fact, pay their fair share of tax in the markets in which they operate. And the second pillar, which is about ensuring a minimum level of taxation, with a view not to remove tax competition, but to put some multilaterally agreed limitations on it. Now, there are some specific details that are still to be finalized, And that work is currently underway. And I mean, I've just been to a meeting of European economy and finance ministers in Ljubljana in Slovenia. Slovenia holding the European Council presidency at the moment. And so we are continuing with that engagement. The objective, the intention is to get that to a conclusion by the end of October and to get, hopefully, final endorsement of the agreement at the G20 Leaders Summit in Rome at the end of October.
Let me ask you about another matter that you've commented on recently, and if I've read your words correctly, there is much debate, as you know, all over the world, and as a very recently Minister of Finance for Australia, you understand the debate about the level of government support through the COVID period, whether the expenditures are too large, whether the deficits that we are seeing are going to present larger problems for us down the road. At what point stimulus ought to be withdrawn or slowed down. You've actually said we need to be careful. Your comments were aimed, I think, specifically at Europe, that we don't curtail support too quickly, learn some lessons from 2008, and make sure we get through this difficult period. Now, those comments were, as I said, focused on Europe, but they, I think, could apply equally to the United States, to Canada, perhaps other parts of the world. Can you expand on those?
Yeah, look, I mean, it is a general comment. And I mean, I suspect that you would have seen those comments in the context of the economic survey we did of the Euro European Union area. But I mean, they are comments that I have made more widely. I mean, when the pandemic first hit, it was really a circumstance where governments had to step up. I mean, I'm sort of, my instinct is to be on the fiscal conservative side, but in the context of a crisis of this nature, of course, governments have to step up and provide the appropriate levels of fiscal support to their economies. I mean, support to businesses and households. Now, the economic recovery is underway, and it certainly is firming up, but it will be important not to withdraw support too early, in order to ensure tentative recovery, doesn't turn back to negative growth. And, having said that, of course, I mean, I also say that we ought to improve the quality and the content of, the fiscal support and I guess better targeted and I guess channel it as much as possible towards future focused investment. I mean, so better targeted to those sectors that genuinely are still in need of, fiscal support, but also, I guess, to shift, as much as possible, a significant component of that fiscal support into future-oriented investment, with a particular focus on dealing with some of the structural challenges that have been with us for some time, like climate change and the digital transformation, managing the digital transformation properly. At some point, we will have to start focusing on budget repair and balance sheet repair and fiscal consolidation again, but it'll be important to get the timing right. But, at some point, we will need to rebuild our resilience so that we are in the right position, in the best possible position to deal with whatever global economic headwinds might come our way down the track. And while we hope it won't be a storm of the sort of magnitude that we've been experiencing over the last year and a half, we can be certain that there will be future shocks and future headwinds to deal with.
Well, how do you think about the global economy going forward? I mean, I think many of us are trying to figure out what it means to live with COVID going forward. It's not going to magically or abruptly or suddenly disappear. It continues to impact. And I want to talk now about North America, the North American economy, for sure. Both the United States and Canada, certain parts of the United States, greater impact than others. How are you seeing the economies of North America?
I mean, the economic recovery is underway, and across North America, the recovery is quite strong. And I mean, I guess there's a range of reasons. I mean, the effectiveness of the vaccines and the vaccine rollout, the fact that certain restrictions, in terms of economic activity, have been, started to be removed. I mean, it's the opening up of the economies with a level of pent-up demand. And indeed, the very significant level of fiscal stimulus that's been going into economies, fiscal and monetary policy support that's been going into economies around the world. I mean, all of that has helped drive a strong recovery, and one that we have to work to sustain. Now, in terms of the most important and the most significant downside risk to that at this stage continues to be the virus. And the most significant risk, dare I say, is that we will end up with a variant of the virus that is resistant to the vaccines that are currently in place. And so that is why we say, and I think others say, that economic policy priority number 1, 2, and 3 right now is to get as many people around the globe vaccinated as quickly as possible. Because of course, I mean, there is this race against seeking to prevent, like, I guess, that might be resistant to the existing vaccines. I mean, beyond that, I mean, we've got to continue to focus on how we can optimize the strength and the quality of the recovery, and in particular, how we can ensure it's a yet strong but also cleaner and fairer growth trajectory moving forward. And I mean, these are policy areas that we're all very involved in.
So, Secretary General, you, as I said earlier, you're the first Secretary General from the Asia Pacific, so it gives you a unique lens. You're a former Minister of Finance in Australia, and there are a couple of questions I want to ask you that certainly will resonate for sure in Canada. Canada and Australia share the notion that we are great houses or warehouses, if you want, of resources, important resources that help drive the global economy. We both have supplied in significant measure some of those resources to China. We both have lived through and lived with, continue to live with, the challenges of being a trading partner with China. And Australia, perhaps more than anybody else, has been on the pointy edge of the stick in trying to, on the one hand, to maintain a healthy trading relationship, two-way trading relationship, and on the other hand, to continue to express legitimate concerns it has and express a reflection of its values in its dealings with China. So given that unique perspective you have, and given how important China is to the global economy, it's not going to go away. What reflection would you have for this group of business leaders at this conference about how to deal, if I can put it that way, with the China question at this point in time? Firstly, I mean, you're right. I mean, China is a very important global economy. It's the second biggest economy in the world. It's the biggest trading partner to a growing number of countries around the world, including a growing number of OECD member countries, and it's an important market. But China also has a different political system, a different economic system. OECD member countries come together around a shared commitment to democracy, human rights, the rule of law, market-based economic principles, rules-based international order, as I mentioned earlier. So inevitably, there will be pressure points. Inevitably, there will be issues on which there will be sometimes more complex conversations. I guess what I would say is that we ought to try and work together wherever we can work together. I mean, climate change is an example. I mean, the world is not going to be able to effectively address the climate change challenge without having China as a positive and positively engaged partner as part of that effort. And then there will be other areas where that will become more difficult. So it's clearly, as market-based democracies, it's a matter of making sensible judgments on where we ought to do everything we can to cooperate and to cooperate better, and where to stand up for our values. And I guess to the extent that it's important to stand up for our values, I would say it's always easier to do that working together as like-minded countries, and I guess working through some of those issues together. And that is where the OECD, I believe, is a good platform for exchange among market-based democracies. I've noted that China has been a participant, or at least observer, in a number of the forum of the managed by led by the OECD. Does that level of engagement continue? Does it grow? Is it flat? Is it I guess what I'm really trying to get is to what extent do we see China continuing to integrate in international rules-based, values-based organizations like the OECD in your observation?
Well, the OECD is certainly think it's important engagement and lines of communications on issues that are important for the world. I mean, China is not a member country. I mean, we have 38 members, and those are 38 market-based democracies. Now, I mean, in relation to China as a partner country, of course, I mean, it's, ultimately, from an OECD point of view, we want to, convince as many countries around the world as possible to adopt our standards on economic, social, environmental policy. And the only way ultimately you can achieve that is by engaging with countries in relation to those issues. So we have 5 so-called partner countries: 1, India, Indonesia, Brazil, and South Africa. Any effective global economic focus, of course, will require focus and an engagement with China as a major global economy.
I was looking through the history of the OECD, and I noted back in 2007, Russia was in process of going through the process of joining perhaps the OECD. The OECD at least was considering membership by Russia. That came to an end in 2014 with Russia's moves with respect to Crimea. Can you give us a sense of where that process is today, if anywhere? And I ask these questions about China and Russia in the context of the big global questions of the day, including the one you just mentioned as one of your priorities, which is climate change or dealing with the challenges of the environment. Is Russia engaged?
Well, I mean, there's so in terms of candidate countries that have expressed their interest in joining the OECD, there are 6, 3 in Europe and 3 in Latin America. And I mean, they are Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia in Europe, and they are Brazil, Argentina, and Peru in Latin America. Now, Russia, you mentioned China. Both those countries are G20 countries, and both those countries have signed on to, for example, the OECD initiated a reform proposal for our international taxation arrangements. So, of course, we have engagement. As we seek to resolve global issues, find solutions to global problems. We of course work with countries around the world that are important parts of settling those solutions in a way that is going to be effective. And I mean, I would expect that to continue moving forward on an issues basis. And I mean, some of these countries, of course, I mean, on specific policy issues, they're involved in conversations, and that, of course, will also continue.
I want to come back to your comments on, you talked about emissions, you talked about the environment. We can talk, I hope, about COP26, Glasgow, where we think that's going, what the opportunity there is for meaningful success at that meeting. But in asking that question, I want to come back to the reality of countries like Australia and dare I say, like Canada, where we have large resource extraction economies historically and traditionally. We have regions of both our countries that are largely dependent upon, in the case of Canada, oil and gas development and extraction and revenues, Western Canada, Eastern Canada. Coal has been a significant part of the economy of certain parts of the country as well. Same is true of Australia. And in fact, when you were in government, I'm trying to put this precisely correct and in a reasoned and fair fashion, you were one of those who had to try and draw the balance between the need to reflect on the challenges of the environment on the one hand, and on the other hand, to recognize the reality of the contribution of certain sectors, mining sector in particular, of Australia's economy. Given the seat you sit in now, and given the clear and I think fairly unequivocal commentary by the OECD with respect to getting to net zero by 2050, how do you reconcile the reality of your time at office and the challenges of being in office and maintaining an economy that's resource-based in Australia with the demands around the world to slow down these resource extraction exercises, be they in Canada, be they in Australia, and to try and reduce CO2 emissions?
Well, I mean, my position back in Australian politics and my position now is the same to the extent that back then and still now, what I say is in order to have effective action on climate change, it's got to be genuinely globally coordinated, and different countries that come into this challenge from different starting positions, facing different circumstances, also with different opportunities to make their best possible contribution, and with likely different pathways as we transition to global net zero. And I guess the key is to have an international process where there can be an appropriate exchange on how different policy mixes and policy methodology, taking into account those different starting positions and different circumstances, can best get us all to the same destination. And when there's got to be a level of, we've got to change from being excessively political and just arguing based on politics, and really taking a problem-solving, a solutions focus to this. And there's got to be, and the Paris Agreement, incidentally, provides for different methods to get to the emissions reduction targets as enshrined in the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement, of course, is where we say that we should get to carbon neutrality in the second half of the century. But there's a clear provision there that different countries, different parts of the world will get there differently. But we need to have a better way of, I guess, comparing effort and comparing both input as well as the output, using different methodologies and different policy mixes, so that we can, I guess, have a better conversation about the equivalency of effort using different methodologies. So, I mean, really, we've got to look at this. The destination is global net zero by 2050. How can we now put how can every country around the world, how can every part of the world now make a proportionate and appropriate contribution to that overall effort? And how can we most effectively coordinate that? I mean, that's really, that is the policy challenge. And yes, there is an increasing level of ambition, which is great. But the key really is, how do we translate the increasing level of ambition into better outcomes, better effort and better outcomes in a globally coordinated fashion?
How encouraged are you or not that on this issue of getting all the major contributors to a roughly equal starting point is really what you're saying? We can't have certain economies take actions that are costly from an economic job and revenue point of view, while others carry on, or others carry on at a very different pace, I think is what you're saying. How confident are you that we can get to a global base or starting point? Because in the absence of doing that, the lack of agreement may lead to a lack of action, and therefore the problem continues to deepen.
Well, look, it's certainly urgent that we get there, but it won't be easy. But we've got to try everything. I mean, there's some parts of the world where spontaneously they're significantly more ambitious, and understandably they're concerned about how increasing levels of ambition can create negative spillovers, can have competitiveness and carbon leakage implications. And certainly whatever is done in one part of the world ought to be designed such that it is environmentally effective. That is, it helps reduce global emissions. It doesn't just shift emissions from one part of the world to another part of the world, but for the same level of economic output, emissions are going to be higher. And that's in the end, as I said earlier, emissions don't stop at anyone's borders. And to the extent that there is action taking in one area, we've got to be very focused on making sure that those actions help solve global problem. and don't just shift it into another area. And we've got to do it in a way that is economically and politically realistic, and that is why, of course, the transition is so important. So, it's important that individual parts of the world, to the extent that they can, that they provide leadership, but it's also important that ultimately we engage in the processes and the conversations to bring, and to be open to the fact that different parts of the world will necessarily have to do things in slightly different ways in order to cater for their local circumstances.
Well, Matthias Cormann, Secretary General, our time is up, but I do want to say that, as I said, given a world in which every fact is challenged, your role, that of your organization, is so critical, so important. And everything I see and hear gives me a great deal of encouragement that we've got a very first-class leader in a very critical role. Thank you for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much. That's very generous. Thank you.